The prince's corpse was cut open at dawn, when the cold in the chambers had not yet managed to overcome the sweetish, rotten stench that permeated everything, from the oak paneling to the fur lining of the curtains. The surgeons, working with thick vinegar-soaked bandages over their faces, could barely stand. Thick steam rose from the cut skin, mixing with the smells of rancid fat, pus, and old blood. One of the young assistants recoiled, stumbled over the foot of the table, and losing consciousness, collapsed onto the stone floor. A servant holding a silver basin to catch the fluid struggled to hold him up, but splashes landed on his boots, leaving oily stains. 2 guards stood by the window, watching the surgeon's every move without taking their eyes off them. They had been ordered not to let anyone leave the room until the body had been examined thoroughly. Just a month ago, the prince was still able to give orders, although even then, his voice was hoarse and his left hand could barely hold a pen. The first signs of illness appeared in the fall. Dark, burgundy spots appeared on his legs, accompanied by a burning pain in his bones. The doctors attributed this to black blood stagnation and performed several bloodletting sessions, removing a cup of thick, almost black blood every week. But there was no improvement. By midwinter, the prince could no longer stand without support, and a constant smell of rancid fat settled in his chambers. The skin on his shins began to spread, exposing the moist yellow tissue beneath. Rumors about his condition spread throughout Moscow faster than messengers could bring news from distant provinces. The notes of the court physician contain a dry entry. On the 5th day of the month, towards evening, His Highness complained of a creeping cold from his feet to his knees. His skin was soft as dough and oozing pus. His mind was clear, but his speech was confused. However, within 2 weeks, his clarity disappeared. The prince began to confuse the names of his courtiers, called for long-dead voivodes, and at night ordered the guards to arm themselves against invisible assassins, whom, according to him, he saw at the threshold. A struggle for access to the sick man began in the palace. The senior nobility, who supported the prince's eldest son, demanded open councils and signatures on a number of decrees. The prince's young wife, relying on her relatives and several influential confessors, insisted that his isolation continue and that the keys to the state seals remain with her. The guards at the doors were changed every hour, and everyone who entered the chambers was required to cross themselves and drink a sip of warm wine with crushed garlic, as ordered by the monks, who claimed that this would protect them from air pollution. The prince's chambers themselves increasingly resembled a hospital ward. The beds were covered with fresh sheets twice a day, but by evening, they were soaked with sweat and secretions. Ulcers the size of a palm appeared on the prince's chest, oozing a cloudy liquid. To hide the smell, resin and dry herbs were thrown into the hearth, but the smoke suffocated the patient, causing him to cough continuously. The doctors took turns smearing the sores with a thick paste of lard, ash, and honey, then bandaging them with coarse linen cloth. At night, the chambers were particularly restless. According to one of the servants, the prince would suddenly sit up, grab the hand of someone sitting nearby, and stare into the void, asking, "Can you hear them? They're calling me." Sometimes he whispered long prayers. Sometimes he demanded that his sword and armor be brought to him immediately. Once, not recognizing anyone, he began to shout that he had been betrayed by everyone and tried to get up, but collapsed on the floor, tearing the skin on his knees. After this fall, he was never lifted from his bed again. At the same time, secret negotiations were already underway outside the palace walls. Supporters of the eldest son agreed with influential boyars to immediately convene a boyar council after the prince's death. The young princess's supporters tried to delay this process, hoping to hold out until the arrival of her brother from Novgorod, who could claim guardianship over the young heir. Meanwhile, the prince's illness progressed. The smell from his bed became so strong that no more than 3 people were allowed in at a time. Servants carrying urine pots wrapped their faces in cloth and drenched themselves in sweat, barely managing to cross the long corridor to the back staircase. Letters from the prince's confessor mentioned that an unclean spirit had attached itself to the body, and therefore every evening psalms were read at the head of the bed, holding lit candles. In early spring, swelling appeared on the prince's neck and face. His eyes became cloudy, and his breathing became hoarse and rapid. The doctors admitted to each other that his heart was weakening, but they only said aloud that the fever would leave his body by Easter. The prince fell asleep more and more often in the middle of conversations, and when he woke up, he asked for white bread and the keys to the treasury. While he was still alive, but already barely able to distinguish those around him, a place was secretly prepared in one of the rooms for the future autopsy. The guards were ordered to detain anyone who tried to take even the slightest piece of clothing or hair from the sick man out of the palace. The courtyard was filled with silent groups of people waiting for news, and stories spread throughout the city about a curse placed on the princely family. The prince's body continued to decompose even while he was still alive. The skin on his shins no longer clung to his muscles, turning into a loose grey-yellow mass from which thick, foul-smelling pus oozed. When changing the bandages, the surgeons and senior physicians tried not to hold their breath for too long. One of them lost consciousness, another suffered a severe vomiting spasm right at the bedside. The senior physician's report, kept in the archives of the palace office, stated, "The left leg has turned black, the flesh is soft like raw dough, and the bone feels like rotten wood when touched." In his final weeks, the prince hardly spoke, but sometimes he would suddenly burst into loud cries. He accused those around him of treason, demanded that his confessor be put in chains, and claimed that he saw rats with human faces running across the ceiling. Servants and guards whispered that at night a dry rhythmic rustling could be heard coming from his chambers, as if someone were walking barefoot on the stone floor, although at that time there were only 2 nurses in the room. The intrigues surrounding the throne reached their peak. The eldest son, who already controlled most of the state affairs, bribed several guards to inform him of every visit to the prince's chambers. The young princess, in turn, secretly summoned her confidants to the sick man, persuading him to sign new documents, but the prince could no longer hold a pen. His hands were so swollen that his fingers could hardly bend. Access to the chambers was restricted to the extreme. Even to bring in food, written permission from the printer was required. The food usually remained untouched. The prince had almost stopped swallowing. The doctors tried to pour a warm decoction of dried berries and opium into his mouth, but he choked and suffocated. After each such attack, his breathing became heavier and more wheezy. At night, only 2 guards and a monk were allowed into the chambers to read prayers until dawn. One of the guards' report states, "Around the 3rd watch, the sovereign raised himself and said that he saw himself in a coffin, and above him were the faces of boyars and women laughing. Then he fell back on his pillows and froze, as if he had breathed his last, but soon opened his eyes again and groaned. The spring warmth exacerbated the stench. The windows were not allowed to be opened for fear of air poisoning, and the bundles of dry wormwood and oak bark hung in the corners did not help. The carpenters, who were secretly preparing an oak coffin, complained that the smell from the chambers was seeping into their workshop. During these days, preparations began for the autopsy, which was planned to be carried out immediately after death, as it was feared that the body would decompose too quickly. Rumors of the prince's imminent demise reached every corner of the city. In the markets, people were already discussing who would take his place. In taverns, they argued about whether there would be new taxes, and among the clergy, it was whispered that the ruler's death was God's punishment for the execution of monks several years earlier. For the last 3 days, he had been practically unconscious. His eyes were half closed, his pupils unresponsive to light. A black crust formed on his lips, and his breathing became rare, with long pauses. One evening, he suddenly opened his eyes, looked around at everyone present, and said in a barely audible voice, "Don't let them near my body." After that, he fell into a deep coma. Death came in the early morning. His face was distorted, his mouth was slightly open, and a viscous liquid with a smell of rot flowed out of it. The guards immediately blocked the entrances, and only the doctors, 2 clerks, and the head of security were allowed into the room. The body was washed with vinegar and wrapped in resin-soaked cloths, but even as it was carried to the autopsy table, the smell became so strong that 2 of those present had to be led away. The autopsy began immediately. At the first incision, thick black-green vapors escaped from the abdominal cavity. One of the assistants collapsed unconscious, while another managed to run to the corner and vomit. It was recorded that the prince's liver was grey-brown in color, and his lungs were filled with a dark, viscous mass. The doctors exchanged glances, but said nothing. The cause of death had to be recorded in the report to the Boyar Council, and their true observations had to remain in secret records. The autopsy took longer than expected. As the surgeons deepened the incisions, the tissue disintegrated under the knife like a rotten rag. In the abdominal cavity, they found large accumulations of cloudy fluid with a sharp, sweetish rotten odor. The junior physician, who was holding a copper basin to collect the contents, covered his face with his sleeve and asked permission to leave, but the chief guard ordered him to stay. The senior surgeon's report, written by hand and kept in the secret papers of the Prikazhnaya Izba, stated the stomach is eaten away by spots, the intestines are full of dark clots, the heart is flabby like wet wax, and the liver is covered with greenish slime. When his chest was opened, a dark, viscous mass was found in his lungs, a sign that the prince had been suffocating in his own secretions during his last days. Purulent cavities were found in the neck tissues, emitting a particularly pungent odor, causing 2 of those present to leave the room, nearly losing consciousness. All the doors were locked with bolts. Armed guards stood outside, denying access even to high-ranking boyars. The decision to impose such controls was made by the prince's eldest son, who did not want anyone else to see the body in its true state. The younger widow and her supporters demanded that the clergy be allowed to perform a funeral service over the body before the autopsy, but their request was denied. This fueled rumors that the prince's death concealed traces of poisoning. When the internal organs were removed, the surgeons began embalming. Strong vinegar mixed with crushed juniper was poured into the body, and the incisions were filled with a powder made of resin and ash. Despite these measures, the corpse quickly darkened and the skin swelled with blisters. The blisters burst on the arms and legs, exposing grey, moist muscles. While the surgeons worked, political negotiations were already underway in the courtyard. The prince's eldest son gathered the old nobility around him, promising to preserve their privileges and lands. The widow's supporters secretly tried to summon her brother from Novgorod with an armed detachment, hoping for a quick intervention. But the guards, controlled by the prince's son, intercepted the messengers and locked all the palace gates. News of the death spread throughout the city before noon. Bells rang alarmingly. Crowds gathered at the Kremlin walls, demanding to know who would be the new ruler. Among the people, it was said that the prince had been killed by a black disease sent upon him for his sins, while others whispered that he had been murdered by his relatives to hasten the change of power. In the evening of the same day, the prince's body, wrapped in a cloth soaked in resin, was taken to a small funeral hall. The guards doubled their watch, fearing attempts to steal parts of the body or clothing, which were believed to have special powers. During the transfer, one of the soldiers complained that the cloth was already damp and sticky, and the smell was seeping through the resin. The first meeting of the Boyar Council took place that same night. In haste, the prince's eldest son was approved as the new ruler. But the minutes recorded heated disputes over the right to the throne, hints of the illegality of the procedure, and accusations of concealing the circumstances of the death. Several influential boyars who supported the widow were expelled from Moscow that same night under the pretext of maintaining order. The next day, the body was laid out for a private viewing by a small circle of trusted individuals. According to one of the guards, the prince's face was already blackened, his lips were sunken, his eyes were sunken and surrounded by dark circles, and a heavy, suffocating smell hung around the coffin, making people feel dizzy. The priests hurried to complete the ceremony without lingering over the body. The prince's funeral was set for the third day after his death. It was dangerous to delay, as the body was rapidly decomposing and even the tarred cloths could not contain the stench. From early morning, the Kremlin courtyards were cordoned off by guards. Crowds who had come to say goodbye were not allowed near, for fear of both riots and the spread of contamination. The townspeople standing at the distant gates could only see several dozen servants in black caftans hurriedly carrying a heavy oak coffin, studded with iron brackets and almost completely covered with thick cloth. Inside the hall where the funeral service was held, the smell was so strong that dozens of large candles and censers with hot coals were lit, onto which resin and herbs were thrown. The priests read their prayers quickly, without looking at the coffin, and clearly tried to leave the room as soon as possible. One of them later admitted in a private conversation that when the lid was opened for the final farewell, his vision darkened. The prince's body was emitting heat, as if it was still alive and decaying at the same time. Behind the coffin, in places of honor, stood the eldest son, already proclaimed the new prince, and the young widow, who kept her eyes down and spoke to no one. There was tension between their entourages. The prince's men kept their hands on the hilts of their swords, while the widow's men held their belts, where daggers could be seen under the folds of their clothes. The funeral took place without the participation of the people. The procession made its way to the princely necropolis through a secret passage known only to a select few. There, in silence and under guard, the body was placed in a stone sarcophagus, covered with lime and sealed with lead, to prevent odors and keep out the unclean. Monastic chronicles say that just as the lid was closed, one of the soldiers dropped dead, clutching his chest. They thought it was a bad sign, but recorded it in the chronicles as apoplectic shock. During the same period, a sharp redistribution of power began in Moscow. The new prince dismissed all those who supported the widow from their posts, sending them into exile or imprisoning them. Several boyars disappeared without a trace, their names no longer mentioned in any official documents. The younger princess was forced to leave the palace and move to her family estate under guard, effectively under house arrest. Rumors about the cause of death multiplied. Some spoke of a deadly black disease caused by prolonged bloodletting, others of poisoning with a rare powder that slowly corrodes the internal organs. The surgeons who participated in the autopsy gave contradictory answers, but they all agreed on one thing. The prince's internal organs were in a condition not characteristic of natural old age. People on the streets said that the prince's death was retribution for the execution of monks and the brutal suppression of uprisings. In the villages, people whispered that he himself had asked not to be buried before his death because he had seen in a dream how his soul was being taken away in chains. These stories intensified the fear and discontent toward the new government, especially among those who remembered the more lenient times of the early reign. A month after the funeral, Moscow's envoys to Novgorod and Tver brought alarming news. The local nobility was in no hurry to swear allegiance to the new prince, expecting an open war to break out between the widow and her son. Soon, clashes began in the border districts between troops loyal to different branches of the family. Thus, the death of one man who had once held all the power of the principality in his hands brought not peace, but new bloodshed. Years later, the chronicles preserved in the monastery archives recorded the following dry line. In that same year, the prince died, and his lands were ravaged, and brother rose against brother.